Oh,
Um,
I do believe that that many of his policies are going to disproportionately impact Black Texans. Uh, I'm seeing it, and I'm seeing like right now these policies that he's implemented at the federal level. Many of my colleagues are trying to implement these policies at the state level, so they're mirroring what Trump is doing at the federal level. It's like a two shot. They get the shot from the federal and the state. That's what I'm seeing. That Trump is is very aligned with Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and the MAGA Republicans that are in control of our state. Even though the majority of the citizens in the state don't support many of those policies, they're implementing them because of a small red meat of the electorate that votes in those primaries. Those are the conspiracy theories. Those are the ones who are more aligned with white supremacy, that don't believe in that believe in making it harder for people to vote. It's those extremes. Those are the ones that it seems to be catering to, and it breaks my heart because these policies are hurting real people. And I know some families that are like receiving aid right now that are probably going to lose it. I know they're going to cut many programs and when they implement vouchers, it's going to take away money from our public schools, and that's going to hurt the inner city schools, the more racially, you know, majority African American and Hispanic school districts in the state that are already underfunded. So yes, these policies are designed and targeted to help the rich at the expense of the poor and even the middle class that disproportionately would be Black and brown. Well, it will impact Black people worse than most other people. And I say that because many of these policies are specifically designed to target Black people. Like, for example, uh, President Trump's executive order ending diversity, equity, and inclusion. Uh, in many regards, what he's done through you see through his cabinet and through people that he's terminated, fired, he's went after Black people. He's went after, specifically, and he's replaced them, even those who had very exemplary qualifications, with white men. And so his quote merit-based argument is really what we call a pretext or an excuse to target Black people, because his word DEI is really a proxy for anti-Black and brown. So really, the people who have been benefited from these policies were there to help level the playing field because of historic discrimination. There's no quotas, and those who held positions were likely, and more times than not, double qualified than their white counterparts. And so I flipped it. DEI definitely earned it, you know, because those people who occupied those positions had exemplary qualifications. No one was there because they were Black. No one was there because they were a woman. No one was there because they were Hispanic. No one was there because you fill in the blank. They were there because they had to work twice as hard as anyone else to get the marginal progress and things that they've gotten because historically they were shut out, period. And so I think that these policies, when you talk about the rollback of federal employees, a lot of African Americans have had jobs within the federal sector. Those jobs were being eliminated. Those African Americans are losing jobs in high numbers. Disproportionately, Black people have been terminated. These DEI policies have targeted, a lot of positions that they were serving in corporations. So you were talking about not just the government, but the private sector. That's why we had an economic boycott on like Target and Walmart and Meta, because those were some of the companies that have ended their DEI policies. And so, yes, we've seen, and when you look at unemployment rates, African Americans disproportionately are usually at the highest in terms of the highest percentages of unemployed. And so these Trump policies are only going to widen that gap. And the policies that he's implementing benefit the very, very wealthy that are more times than not African American. They're Anglo men. And so what you're seeing is early on a gap widening between the have and the have nots. That is what I'm seeing when I look at President Trump and the policies that he's rolled out. When he tried to cut Head Start, many African Americans benefit from Head Start programs that come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds so they can be school ready. When you talk about cutting those programs that have free and reduced lunches that help those kids that are in poverty have a hot meal so they can learn, because studies have shown that kids are harder to learn when when there's food insecurity. Cutting healthcare, cutting so
I did.
these policies really, as I see it, are really designed to target and hurt many African Americans and other minorities, but particularly African Americans are going to be, in my opinion, hit the hardest. When last session, during the 88th legislative session, we passed in Texas Senate Bill 17 and Senate Bill 18. Those were provisions that ended DEI in colleges and universities in Texas. And so I have found, and I've seen the adverse impact upon that legislation at our universities, our public universities, our flagship universities like the University of Texas, Texas A&M, and other universities, all state universities have implemented these policies, which have reduced the number of African American and minority faculty. It has reduced the number of African American and minority students. It's that coupled with the Supreme Court striking down race-based submissions last year. And so what my bill attempts to do is to roll back some of the harm that has happened. Now, realistically, I'm going to be very honest with the readers. I don't think that the appetite is there from this legislative body, the Republican majority, to repeal it. I don't. But I do believe that it's necessary to have the conversation about filing legislation that is good public policy. Why do I say that? Because in Texas, a lot of people don't realize this, but Texas has more African Americans than any other state in the country. Texas is a majority minority state made up of a very diverse multiracial coalition, and based on the census, the last census that we had in 2020, we do a census every 10 years. 90+% of the growth of Texas was because of Hispanic and African American growth in Texas, making it the fastest growing state in the country. And so our diversity is our strength. And when we have policies that adversely impact that diversity, and it actually has the really the I would say, some would say unintended consequence, but I would say it's intended it's designed to do what it's doing, but it hurts and harms, those faculty, staff, and students. Then I wanted to file a piece of legislation that showed why this bill is harmful so that we could educate the public about public policy that was harmful and how we can change it. Because it's one thing just to talk about, oh, this is bad, this is bad. I wanted to offer a solution of how we fix it, even though I know realistically the likelihood of me being able to pass it is probably, 0.1%. That's just realistically. So I'm being very practical, but at the same time, I want it to be aspirational to give people something that they could advocate for. We were advocating against a lot of things like vouchers,
Yeah.
other anti-DEI bills, but I wanted to give people something that they could advocate for while they're also advocating against these other bad bills. So I am in my 8th term in the Texas House of Representatives. And so I've learned how to work relationships. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is to appeal to some of my colleagues um, within some of the leadership roles that I've had within the Legislative Black Caucus or the House Democratic Caucus to talk about, you know, how this is good for the economy if we pass certain bills. So sometimes I talk about bills from a fiscal impact because a lot of conservatives call themselves fiscally responsible and conservative. And so I try to use those talking points and those that kind of narrative to talk about how this is would be good for the Texas economy and focus on that. Unfortunately, it's not as persuasive when they are afraid of their right MAGA base that votes in Republican primaries. Because I've used, for example, um, polls and that show, for example, that overwhelming majority of Texans wanted to raise the age to purchase assault rifles. So I used this polling policy to say, hey, this is good public policy. Majority of Texans are in favor of it. But then my Republican colleagues are afraid to buck the far right ring extremists that vote heavily in Republican primaries, and also the special interests that keep a legislative scorecard. And so it unfortunately has gotten so polarizing basically because of these policies at the federal level with Trump and the MAGA that they're now not even doing what a majority of Texans. So it's hard to appeal to them on those issues. I'm finding it hard where they used to be more persuasive. Now it's not as persuasive because of everything is so partisan. Everything is so not everything. That's an overstatement, but so many things when it comes to social issues, attacks on the LGBTQ community, attacks on women's reproductive rights, attacks on, DEI, attacks on LGBTQ communities. So those have become so polarizing that they're used as wedge issues that you can't really appeal to their conscience because that's the red meat for their base. And many of them are afraid of someone primarying them. That means they're going after them in their Republican primary to the right of them, even on one vote. And so that's why last session we killed vouchers, and then Governor Abbott targeted those rural Republicans based on that vote. And then most of them lost their elections. So it's becoming more difficult to get bipartisan support on some of these social issues. And so for me, what I find now it is about educating the public about why elections matter and why they should be engaged and vote differently in the next election, because it's harder and harder to convince many of these MAGA extremists to change their vote, change their mind when they're set in their ways. Absolutely. I think they help. I was one who went on record using my social media platform to encourage my supporters to do the economic blackout because we have to hit them in the pocketbook. Sometimes you have, that's the only way that you can hit them so that you get their attention. You would do it with the vote, you do it with the pocketbook. One of the most successful economic boycotts was the Montgomery bus boycott that was led by the late great Dr. Martin Luther King. And it started when Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus. They were fighting to end Jim Crow laws that had separate but equal facilities, that they were separate, but they were never equal. And so, based on that resistance, that boycott, they were able to break barriers and overcome obstacles by doing what they call good trouble. John Lewis called it good trouble. We're about to embark upon on this weekend. I'm going to Selma for the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, where Dr. King and others tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, in the march from Selma to Montgomery, and they were beaten trying to fight for voting rights and for democracy. Well, I believe that we're going to see more people making good trouble because we're in a different era, but it is a different kind of civil rights era that Trump has ushered in with his MAGA policies. You're going to see more resistance, more economic boycotts, more protests, more rallies. I was at a rally yesterday at City Hall with other faith-based leaders, Congressman Al Green and Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia, and State Representative Gene Wu and State Senator Molly Cook, and other people from different organizations like the NACP and LULAC and Asian American organizations. We were there in solidarity to show that we're not going back, that we're going to fight, we're going to stand up and speak truth to power against Trump and his MAGA extreme policy. So I think it's going to take more of that in order to, show that we're not going to back down and let them walk over us and take us back to dark days. We made tremendous progress in this country because of those people who took a stand. Some of them risked their own lives for the freedoms and liberties that I and many others enjoy today. But if we're not careful, many of those rights that we won will be lost. And that is why on our watch, we must be the resistance. We must be the agitators. We must be the ones who are willing to say, we're not going to allow you to do this without a consequences. And that is for Target and those other companies, they've seen share prices plummet. They've seen customers flee. And that's making a difference because it rewards those companies that are willing to stand with us and still keep their DEI policies because these companies didn't have to do it. They're in the private sector. Only the government employees Trump was able to do that with because they haven't passed any federal law yet that would end DEI. So therefore, it's only happened. He can only order it for those government agencies. He can't order it from the private sector until they pass legislation. So that is why we targeted those ones who ended it. And I do think it's taking a toll, and it will make a difference in the long haul. Dr. King once had a quote that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I do believe that in the long haul, we will see better days, better policies, but we're just going to have to fight like hell in the meantime to overcome these bad policies. I do believe it's going to hurt Trump in the midterms in 2026. I do think that it's going to cause the Republicans to lose the majority in the House of Representatives because people are going to be sick and tired of these bad policies and they're going to vote out these MAGA extremists in Congress, in the House, and get a Democrat majority. And that will help balance out Trump from enacting some of these policies after the midterms. Texas leads the nation with the highest number of uninsured. right? We're now one of 10 states without Medicaid expansion. We're losing billions of federal dollars to help people stay healthy. Healthcare should be a basic human right. And because of this partisan politics that these, again, I hate to say it, but I was there when President Obama was elected. They did not want to pass the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. And now we are still living with that in Texas, where other red states have said, yeah, we need these federal funds so that we can get access to help in our uninsured get necessary health care. And sadly, we're losing not only federal dollars, but human lives because people aren't getting screenings for diabetes, for cancer, for other diseases that can be treated if they're caught early with care. They can be treated with medication, but people can't afford CAT scans and MRIs and diagnostic exams that cost tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket. So without healthcare, they only go to the emergency room when they're very sick. They didn't go get the preventive care. They didn't go get that lump checked out on their breast to then it was stage 1 and they could have had it removed. It's stage 4 and it's spread. That is the problem that we have when we don't have access to Medicaid and we don't have access to health care. Black women in Texas, they lead the nation in maternal deaths. There's more people who are going to the emergency room because they don't have a primary care doctor, because they don't have health care. And so I'm, again, realistically, it's going to be difficult to pass it. But when you have the Hospital Association, the Texas Medical Association, the Chambers of Commerce, they all think that we need Medicaid expansion because it's good for the economy, it's good for Texans, it stimulates the economy, it helps ensure that these hospitals stay open. Rural hospitals are closing because of this very fact that we don't have Medicaid expansion. We, as a state, our economy is great, but it would be so much greater because we would have had billions of more poured into our healthcare system. But the most important, the human element, we could have had more healthy Texans. There's research that shows that there are people who have died because they didn't catch a disease early enough. That is a fact. That is not hyperbole. That is not a scare tactic. That is science. If you early detection helps save lives. And when people don't have access to healthcare, they don't get that early detection more times than not. So they tend to get sicker and have more medical necessity because they're worse off than they would have been if they would have caught it early. The doctor could have said, hey, we're going to start you on this regimen. Hey, we're going to do chemo, radiation. Hey, we're going to remove this. Hey, we're going to do that. They don't get that. So yes, it's a matter of life and death. And it's cruel to me that in this state, we continue to have partisan politics instead of prioritizing human health and dignity for people that get can get health care regardless of their income levels. And that is where Medicaid expansion comes in because most people who are affluent, they either have health care or they can pay out of pocket. Most people who are middle class and poor without Medicaid expansion or insurance, then they can't afford to go see the doctor until 9 times out of 10 until they're very, very, very sick. I anticipate that the National Rifle Association, that's known as the NRA, and the Texas Rifle Association, they will try to do their best to kill any gun reform legislation that makes it more difficult for people to purchase firearms because they're only interested in profits for their gun manufacturers and their shareholders. Even if it means red flag laws to help save lives, to keep guns out of people's hands that shouldn't have them, even if it means closing the gun show loophole so that you can't go get a gun without a background check like you can if you go to a gun show or if you go to a private seller, or if you go to a gun store, there's a background check. We need to close the gun show loophole. I have a bill to do that. Purchase an assault rifle. Right now, an 18-year-old cannot go purchase a pack of cigarettes. They cannot go purchase a beer, right? Because we raised the age to 21. But they can go purchase a lethal weapon, a military style rifle. No one can make that make sense. We need to at least raise the age to purchase an assault rifle to 21 because no high school student should potentially be able to go buy one when they can't even go buy a gun, alcohol or a beer because they're not mature enough to handle a weapon of mass destruction like the shooter at Uvalde, right? So we need to have some common sense gun reform pieces of legislation. Sadly, those colleagues of mine on the other side of the aisle refused in Texas, even though we had Uvalde with 21 children who were passed away by a senseless death. We've had shootings in churches and malls and movie theaters, and we can't get any gun reform legislation. The only thing that they're willing to do is talk about mental health and arming teachers and putting more armed officers in schools and hardening schools. But they don't want to do anything to address more common sense gun reform laws that don't infringe upon people's Second Amendment, but ensures that only people that should have guns have them. We've made it easier to purchase guns. We've taken away the ability to have a license. You don't have to have a license to carry a gun anymore, right? You know that. We have open carry in Texas. So we've done everything but just give people a gun at 18, right? We've made it harder. This is one thing I want to emphasize. We've made it harder for people to vote, which is a fundamental right. Harder to register to vote, harder to actually vote with strict voter ID laws. But we've made it easier to purchase guns. To me, that doesn't make sense when you have voting as a fundamental right, and owning a gun is something that is not essential to our democracy, like voting is. But we made it more difficult to vote and easier to purchase a gun. And so I think that they're misplaced priorities. I think that we need to stand up to the special interests of the gun manufacturers and say we're going to put people over profits, and we're going to have some common sense gun reform, safe storage laws, raising the age, red flag laws. Those are some things that we can do, not to end all gun violence, but to reduce the number of guns that are in the hands of people that shouldn't have them. More resistance in the House. I think it's going to be close, but I'm very concerned that it could pass on a very tight margin. You need 76 votes out of the 150. And Governor Abbott has worked very hard to primary those Republicans that stood in the way of vouchers when we killed it in the last session in the three special sessions. So I'm going to do everything I can with some of my other colleagues to defeat it because vouchers takes money out of our public schools, our taxpayer money, and funds wealthy families to be able to send their kids to private schools that they already send their kids to on our dime, right? I mean, so most of these families that are in poor and middle class neighborhoods, they can't benefit from the vouchers. First of all, these private schools don't have to accept the students that they can say, no, I don't want this student in my school, regardless if you have the voucher or not. They don't have to take students with disabilities. They don't have to provide transportation. They don't provide transportation. So there's so many limitations on schools that are private versus public schools. And our public schools are our neighborhood schools that our kids go to get an education to compete in a global economy. So vouchers are going to make our schools lose the money that's already very slim. In fact, Texas ranks 46 out of 50th in funding per pupil. With vouchers, it'd go down to probably 47, 48. So what are we trying to be the worst? And then on top of that, you take um, most of the schools that the neighborhoods that are going to be hit hardest is the black and brown schools that are already struggling. And if a student is accepted from one of those schools to go to a private school with that voucher, and then it doesn't work out, and the school says, hey, you're out of here, which they can easily, they have to go back to the public school. They have to accept that student, but they've already lost the money. The money doesn't follow the student. So there's so many gotchas built in. When we looked at the research, other states that have implemented this voucher scam, it has not turned out to be good educational outcomes when it comes to bridging the achievement gaps or college readiness. So, yes, vouchers are a scam to subsidize the wealthy and the well off. And that is what Governor Abbott and the MAGA extremists in charge, they're catering to the billionaires. And that is the only reason why we're even having this voucher discussion. We should be talking about fully funding our public schools, giving our teachers a pay raise. We should be talking about other issues, but this should not be an emergency item by Governor Abbott. It is a misplaced priority, and it is a solution in search of a problem. I've seen in the Houston area alone a proliferation, a overabundance of concrete batch plants in black and brown communities where they don't build them, they don't put those in affluent Anglo areas, River Oaks, other areas of wealth, the woodlands, and you name it, Sugarland, Pearland. They don't have concrete batch plants, and they tend to go in black and brown communities. And so I've seen environmental justice issues where there's these concrete batch plants, industry bills, other environmental hazards in these neighborhoods that don't have the ability to fight back. They don't have the lobbyists. And as a result of that, I've seen adverse health outcomes, cancer clusters. There are particles in the air that are emitted from these concrete batch plants in these black and brown communities. So environmental justice issues are real, and statistics show that these communities tend to have more cases of asthma, and sadly, they build these closer towards the schools that these children attend, where they've had adverse health impacts. We've seen cancer clusters in the Fifth Ward area where the Environmental Protection Agency has come in. And so our county attorney has come in, Christian Menifee. But these are real situations. And that's why I filed these pieces of legislation so that we could get the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which gives out these permits, to not give permits to these companies that are building in these black and brown communities that are very unsafe for the environment. And unfortunately, our state is on the wrong side of this. And my bills would propose legislation that studies it and so we can change it to look at the impact that climate change is having uh, that on our environment, to look at how we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and go to more clean energy, focusing more on renewables like wind and solar, so that we can and wind, and so that we can have more clean air for our future and more sustainable clean air for our environment and not have continuous adverse you know to our environment. And these many of these 100-year events that we're seeing are as a result of the effects of climate change. But our state won't do the to stand up to the oil and gas industry and says we need to make changes. The federal government has done it under President Biden, under President Obama, and Texas fought it because they didn't want regulations to hinder their drilling. They didn't want regulations to hinder them from having to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted from their fossil fuels in the oil and gas industry and fracking. Uh, uh, but that is what we see in Texas that is beholden to industry and put the profits over those shareholders over the public health of the citizens of the state. That is why I filed these bills, because I want every community to be safe, not just the safety of a community shouldn't be dependent on your zip code. And right now, that is more determinative of your health is your zip code. And so my legislation addresses those environmental concerns in communities of color. And that is why I filed the series of bills that I filed. And I happen to be on the committees that have jurisdiction over those matters, environmental regulation and energy resources. And I've used my position on those committees to have a seat at the table to advocate for those minority communities that don't have lobbyists. They don't have people there to have the resources to push back on these bad policies that hurt their neighborhoods. So I'm that voice, and other organizations like Environment Texas and the Sierra Club uh, and the Environmental Defense Fund. Those are the organizations that I work with to give a fight to the industry to get laws and policies that kind of help level the playing field for many of these communities that are just trampled over. I've seen so many people over the years testify in front of my committee about how this has adversely impacted them, and it falls on deaf ears. Well, one of my constituents, Jocelyn Griffin, her son, Evan, was killed while being housed at the Harris County Jail. And, we saw a record number of inmates that were awaiting their day in court that were killed while waiting their day in court uh, in the Harris County Jail. Now, everyone, based on our judicial system, is presumed innocent, and that means that you have people that could have been innocent are therefore a misdemeanor because they couldn't make bail. They got the death sentence. I don't think anyone should get the death penalty while waiting for their day in court. And so this bill would create a study, because the Texas Commission on Jail Standards, they came down on Harris County over and over again with deficiencies, understaffing. Right now, Harris County is transporting some of the inmates out of state because they're overcrowded and they don't have sufficient resources. So my bill would create a study so that we can find best practices so that we don't have more of the Evans that die while waiting their day in court. We don't have more there, and it's not just him, but there's so many others. And I said, this is enough. One life is one too many, but she had so many, a record number over the last several years that have died for various reasons, and that is unacceptable. And so that is what my bill is designed to do. And I'm prayerful. My constituent, Jocelyn Griffin, God bless her, she's turned her pain into purpose. And I've worked with her. And I met so many other people that are represented by civil rights attorney Ben Crump, that have had loved ones that have been killed in the Harris County Jail. So my bill is designed to do a study so that they can implement best practices to prevent other deaths from occurring while people are waiting their day in court. If you call yourself a Christian, which many of the conservatives call themselves Christian, that God loves all children, God loves all people are created equal. And I think discrimination is discrimination, whether you discriminate against a person because they're black or a woman or Asian or Muslim or gay or straight, or straight. I think we should treat people equally, regardless of their sexual preference, gender identity, or, you know, I think that we should treat people with dignity and respect and love people. You can love people and still hate what you believe is a sin. You can love a person but hate the sin. So I think that we need to work on not being hypocrites, as many of my Republican colleagues are. They they call themselves, Christians, which God taught us to love all, and all doesn't mean just the people who you identify with. It means everyone, regardless of what they look like, who they love. And the last I checked, I'm more concerned about Nazis and white supremacists than I am, LGBTQIA or drag queens. But they so fixated on legislating morality with, gender sports and LGBTQ, what bathrooms they're going in or how they identify themselves with or who they marry, as opposed to, being pro-life and caring about keeping people safe from gun violence, making sure that people have access to health care, discriminating against people on the basis of race and religion with this anti-Muslim rhetoric and Muslim bans, anti-immigrant legislation, enforce mass deportations when we are a nation of immigrants. So my message is clear that I'm going to stand for human rights. I'm going to stand because just like when we went through the civil rights, as I talked about earlier, if I was just, if it wasn't for a multiracial coalition of people standing up, I wouldn't be able to be holding public office today. But it was because of people coming together to stand up against bigotry that I'm able to stand here today as a state representative. So I want to use my voice to fight against bigotry, uh, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBTQ. We should be pro human rights. And that means that should be a basic fundamental right for everybody. And I see a rise right now in, you know, Christian nationalists, white supremacists, Proud Boys, you name it. I mean, many of them were the insurrectionists that stormed our Capitol, that call themselves patriots, that want to make America great again, that want to take back their country, that want to implement these anti-DEI pieces of legislation, anti-LGBTQ. So yes, I am going to keep speaking truth to power, standing up and fighting to protect all communities, and that includes the LGBTQIA and other marginalized communities.